The morning light came through the tall windows of Silverwood Crest, like thin gold thread. It touched the polished timber floor, the heavy silver tea service on the sideboard, and the back of a young woman who stood near the far wall, with her hands folded in front of her faded green dress. Her name was Hazel Brooks, and she was 23 years old. Her dress had been new once, many seasons ago, but the green fabric had washed out to something like the color of a winter leaf. The lace at her wrists had been mended twice, with careful, tiny stitches, a fact she knew well but did not care about. She had walked 9 miles through the heavy morning rain to reach this estate, and the dress had survived the journey, which was all that truly mattered to her. The massive drawing room smelled of fresh beeswax and dried pine needles, showing that someone had polished the floorboards only hours before. A large grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner, marking the seconds with a steady, heavy beat that seemed to fill the quiet spaces of the room. Outside the glass, a single bird called out from the dark woods, and then went silent. Hazel kept her hands folded tightly and her chin level, refusing to look at the other people who shared the room with her. There were 4 of them, all young women dressed in fine silks that showed no signs of wear or mending. They had not spoken a single word to Hazel since she had arrived at the house, choosing instead to look at her damp dress with cold eyes before turning away. They looked at her the way a wealthy traveler looks at a broken wheel in the middle of a muddy road. A heavy oak door opened at the far end of the long room, and a tall man stepped into the space. He was older, with neat gray hair brushed flat against his head, and he wore a plain black coat that identified him as a senior member of the household staff. He carried a small leather book in his left hand, and looked around the room until his eyes found the young woman in the faded green dress. He stepped forward with measured paces, his leather boots clicking softly against the polished floorboards. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice low and formal. Hazel stepped forward from the wall, feeling the cold moisture of the rain still soaking through her stockings inside her thin shoes. She did not let the discomfort show in her face, or the posture of her shoulders. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. The older man looked at her damp dress for a brief second, his eyes moving quickly over the mended lace before rising to meet her gaze. "You are here to apply for the position of companion to Mrs. Abigail Stone," he stated. "Yes, sir," Hazel said. The man closed his small book. "Mrs. Stone is not receiving visitors or applicants today because she is feeling unwell. Mr. Miller, the estate manager, will see you instead to discuss the matter. Please wait here until you are called." He turned and left the room through the same door, leaving Hazel to stand by the wall once more. The 4 women in silk stopped pretending to ignore her, and the one with bright red hair made a small, sharp sound in her throat that was almost a laugh. Hazel kept her hands folded and began to count the small panes of glass in the tall window across the room, finding exactly 12 panes before counting them again to keep her mind steady. She had not eaten any food since the previous afternoon, having spent her very last coin on the public coach from the nearby village. The coach had broken an iron axle 6 miles short of the estate gates, forcing her to walk the remaining distance through the rising storm. The rain had started an hour before she reached the main driveway, soaking her hair and the shoulders of her thin wool coat. As she stood counting the 12 panes of glass for the 3rd time, a small movement near the side of the room made her look up from the window. A man was standing in the open archway that led toward the western gardens, having entered without using the main doors. He had white hair that looked like fresh winter snow, and his skin was completely white, smooth as polished marble, and untouched by the sun. He was not exceptionally tall, but he seemed to fill the archway with his presence, his dark woolen coat bearing heavy drops of rain across the shoulders. His boots were covered in dark mud at the toes, suggesting he had been walking through the deep woods despite the bad weather. His eyes were dark and steady, moving slowly across the room until they fixed upon Hazel. Hazel looked back at him because looking away felt like a form of weakness, and she had promised herself she would not show weakness in this house. The white-haired man did not smile or nod. He simply watched her with a calm, unblinking gaze that lasted for several seconds. One of the women on the sofa noticed him then, letting out a sharp gasp as she stood up far too quickly from the cushions. The other three women rose immediately, smoothing their silk skirts and trying to arrange their faces into pleasant expressions. But the man did not look at them. He kept his steady gaze on Hazel for one more moment before turning back into the shadows of the garden archway. The red-haired woman sat down again, her face twisting into a small expression of anger as she looked at her companions and then at Hazel. "Goodness," she said, her voice loud enough to travel across the quiet room. "What a strange creature to be wandering through the main house at this hour. One can hardly tell the masters from the stable hands these days." The other women laughed softly, and the one with the long pale face looked directly at Hazel before speaking. "Though I suppose one can hardly tell the ladies from the kitchen maids either, given the cheap clothes some people choose to wear in public." Hazel did not move a single muscle, keeping her hands folded over her wrist and her eyes fixed on the 12th pane of glass. The pale-faced woman waited for an angry reply, and when Hazel remained silent, she turned back to her friend with a louder laugh. "Mrs. Stone must be truly desperate if she allows a girl in a ruined dress to walk through the front door as if she belonged here. I would not let such a person near my carriage." Hazel felt her right thumb press hard against the bone of her left wrist under her folded hands, using the small, sharp pain to keep her feet steady on the floor. A young servant girl entered the room then, bowing slightly to the women on the sofa before turning to Hazel. "Miss Brooks, Mr. Miller is ready to see you now. Please follow me down the hall." Hazel stepped away from the wall and followed the servant out of the room, never looking back at the four women who sat laughing on the long sofa. The hallway was long and lined with large oil paintings that showed men in old coats and women in high-waisted dresses, all of them staring down with dark eyes. Hazel walked behind the servant girl until they reached a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. The girl knocked twice, opened the door, and stepped aside to let Hazel enter a small, warm study, where a wood fire burned low in a stone hearth. The room smelled of old paper, leather books, and clean wood smoke, creating a space that felt much smaller and friendlier than the grand drawing room. A man in his 50s sat behind a large mahogany desk near the window, his tired eyes looking up as Hazel stepped inside the room. He gestured toward a deep leather chair on the near side of the desk. "Miss Brooks, please take a seat," he said, his voice calm and businesslike. Hazel sat down, holding her back straight, to keep from sinking too deeply into the soft leather cushions. Mr. Miller picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk and looked at the neat handwriting. "The letter from your local minister states that you are the daughter of a schoolmaster who passed away 2 years ago, and that you have been living with your aunt in the lower valley." "Yes, sir," Hazel said, keeping her voice steady and clear. "And your aunt can no longer afford to keep you in her home," Mr. Miller noted, looking over the top of the paper. "She has 5 children of her own, sir, and there is no longer any room or money for me," Hazel explained. Mr. Miller set the paper down on the desk and folded his hands together. "I must be entirely honest with you about this position, Miss Brooks. The work is not physically difficult, but it requires a great deal of patience. Mrs. Abigail Stone is very old, and her mind often wanders into the past. She forgets who is in the room with her, and she can become confused quite easily. The last companion stayed for only 4 weeks before leaving, and the one before her left after 2 months. The pay is £20 a year, paid every 3 months, and your room and board are fully included. It is a lonely life for a young woman of 23. Hazel looked at the small flames moving over the oak logs in the fireplace, feeling the warmth begin to dry the edges of her green dress. "Sir," she said, turning her eyes back to the manager, "I will not leave after 4 weeks, and I will not leave after 2 months. I have no other home to return to, and if Mrs. Stone will have me, I will stay for as long as she needs someone to sit with her." Mr. Miller watched her face for a long moment, his careful mouth softening into a slight nod. "I believe you mean what you say," he said, dipping a black quill into an inkwell and signing the bottom of the paper. "You will begin your duties tomorrow morning. Today, the housekeeper will show you to your room and provide you with some hot supper." He pushed the paper across the desk for her to sign, and Hazel took the quill, writing her name in clear, elegant letters that did not shake. Mr. Miller took the signed agreement back and dried the ink with a small box of sand. "There is one more matter I should mention, Miss Brooks," he said, looking at her with a serious expression. "The white-haired man you saw in the drawing room just now is Mr. Benedict Stone. He is the master of Silverwood Crest, and the people in the valley call him the Vampire King, because his family has ruled these northern woods since the first cabins were built." Hazel felt her mouth go slightly dry, remembering the pale skin and the steady, dark eyes of the man in the garden archway. "He returned from the deep forest early this morning," Mr. Miller continued, watching her face for any sign of fear. "He prefers to walk alone before the household is awake, and he did not expect to find visitors in the drawing room." "I understand, sir," Hazel said, keeping her face perfectly still. Mr. Miller seemed satisfied with her calm reaction, nodding as he pulled a braided bell cord behind his desk. "Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, will be here in a moment to take you upstairs. Welcome to Silverwood Crest, Miss Brooks." Hazel stood up from the leather chair, her legs feeling heavy from the long walk through the mud. She made a short, polite curtsy to the manager and walked out into the hallway, where she leaned her shoulder against the wood paneling for 5 seconds to catch her breath. She had found a place to stay, and that was enough for now. The room Mrs. Gable gave her was located at the very top of the back stairs, right beneath the eaves of the slate roof. It was a small, clean space, containing a narrow wooden bed with a gray wool blanket, a plain washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single small window that looked out over the kitchen gardens and the dark edge of the forest. A small yellow candle sat in a brass holder on top of a low chest of drawers. Mrs. Gable, a wide woman with large hands and a kind face, set a heavy wooden tray down on the chest. "You eat every bit of this soup and bread," the housekeeper said, pointing a finger at the steaming bowl. "You look as thin as a willow branch, and the rain has taken all the color from your cheeks." "Thank you, ma'am," Hazel said, grateful for the warmth of the food. "Be down at the kitchen door at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning," Mrs. Gable added as she walked toward the exit. "I will show you the rest of the house then, and take you up to meet the old lady." She left the room, closing the heavy door softly behind her. Hazel sat on the edge of the narrow bed and ate the hot potato soup slowly, enjoying the taste of the fresh bread and the sharp yellow cheese. When the tray was completely empty, she set it on the floor and lay down on the gray blanket without taking off her green dress. She did not cry, having learned 2 years ago that tears did not change the price of bread or bring back the dead. She simply listened to the quiet sounds of the great house, hearing the wind rattle the window frame, until she closed her eyes and fell asleep. In a large dark room in the northern wing of the house, Benedict Stone stood by a tall window and watched the rain turn into a thick mist over the pine trees. He was 31 years old, though his pale face looked exactly as it had a decade ago, showing no signs of age or worry. He had lived in this valley for a very long time, watching the village grow from a few wooden huts into a bustling town, while he remained unchanged in the shadows of Silverwood Crest. The townspeople feared him, but respected his laws, knowing that the Vampire King protected the valley from winter hardships and kept the mountain roads safe from bandits. He did not care for the grand parties or the wealthy families who tried to gain his favor, preferring the silence of his books and the cold air of the midnight forest. He was thinking now about the young woman he had seen standing near the drawing-room wall that morning. He had not intended to meet anyone, having used the side door to avoid tracking mud through the grand entrance after his long night walk. He had expected to find the room empty, but instead, he had found 4 wealthy sisters sitting on the silk sofa and 1 lonely girl standing by the window. The sisters had risen immediately, their faces full of false smiles and ambition. But the girl in the faded dress had simply looked at him with honest eyes. She had looked at his white hair and pale skin without flinching, as if he were nothing more than another human being standing in the rain. He turned away from the window and sat down at his wide desk, where 3 letters concerning the timber mills were waiting for his signature. He picked up his pen, but did not dip it in the ink, his mind returning to the steady expression on the girl's face. Mr. Miller would have hired her by now, as the manager knew exactly which people had the strength to stay in a quiet house. Benedict knew that the old lady could be difficult, her mind wandering through memories of people who had been buried in the valley churchyard 50 years ago. Most young women grew frightened of the silence or the strange rumors that surrounded the estate, leaving within a few weeks to return to the brighter towns. He wondered if this new companion would stay, or if she would pack her small bundle of clothes the first time the winter wind howled through the chimneys. He pressed his fingers against the polished wood of his desk, feeling the coldness of his own skin, and decided he would watch her from a distance. The next morning, Mrs. Gable took Hazel through the main rooms of the estate, showing her the large library with its thousands of leather-bound volumes and the long portrait gallery where the old family members looked down from the walls. "You are not to enter the north wing under any circumstances," the housekeeper warned, pointing toward a heavy set of double doors at the end of the second floor. "Those are Mr. Benedict's private rooms, and nobody goes inside except his personal servant and the maid who carries the firewood." "I understand," Hazel said, having no desire to wander into places where she was not wanted. "Mrs. Stone will be waiting for you in the small morning room," Mrs. Gable said as they climbed the central staircase. "She likes to sit where the sun hits the rug, even if she cannot always see it clearly." They found the old woman sitting in a high-backed chair near a wide window, her white hair covered by a neat lace cap and her hands resting on a knitted shawl in her lap. Her eyes were a faded gray, and she did not look up immediately when the door opened. "Aunt Abigail," Mrs. Gable said softly, stepping into the warm room. "This is Miss Brooks. She has come to sit with you and help you with your reading." The old woman turned her head slowly, her eyes clouding as she looked at Hazel's face. "You are not Sarah," she said, her voice thin and sharp like paper. "Sarah went to the village to buy some blue ribbon." "No, ma'am," Hazel said, stepping forward with a gentle smile. "My name is Hazel. I can help you find your ribbon if you like, or I can bring you some warm tea." The old woman looked at her for a few more seconds before turning back to the window. "Sarah always brought 3 lumps of sugar in the white cup," she muttered. "I will bring it exactly that way," Hazel replied, walking over to the small table where the tea service was kept. She spent the rest of the morning sitting by the old woman's chair, listening to stories about winters that had happened before Hazel's father was even born. Sometimes Abigail forgot where she was, asking if the horses were ready for the carriage ride or if her mother had finished mending the lace tablecloth. Hazel answered every question with a calm, quiet voice, never correcting the old lady's mistakes or showing any signs of impatience. At noon, a young maid brought a tray of hot mutton broth and fresh bread, and Hazel held the spoon steadily when the old woman's hands began to shake too much to manage the meal. "You have a very quiet way about you," Abigail said, as Hazel wiped her chin with a clean linen napkin. "The last girl had a loud voice that made my head hurt behind the eyes." "I will keep my voice low, ma'am," Hazel promised, helping her settle back against the soft pillows for her afternoon nap. 10 days passed in the same quiet manner, and Hazel began to feel at home in the small morning room. She rose every morning at 5:30, took her breakfast of tea and bread in the quiet kitchen, and spent her days caring for the old woman. She did not see Mr. Benedict Stone during these days, though she heard his low voice in the downstairs hall once or twice as he gave orders to the butler. One rainy afternoon, however, the quiet routine of the house was broken by the arrival of a fine carriage drawn by 2 black horses. Mrs. Gable came up the stairs with a dark look on her face, holding a fresh tray of clean cups. Miss Chloe Higgins and her sisters have arrived for tea, the housekeeper whispered to Hazel. They are distant relations of the old lady's late husband, and they come here twice a year to remind everyone that they exist. They are not pleasant women, Miss Brooks. Do not let their words trouble you. Hazel nodded, remembering the red-haired woman from her first morning in the drawing room. A moment later, the door opened and the four sisters entered, their silk dresses rustling loudly as they filled the small room with the sharp scent of expensive lavender perfume. Chloe Higgins stepped toward the old lady's chair, her bright red hair catching the firelight. "Aunt Abigail," she said in a high, sweet voice that sounded entirely false. "We have brought you some fresh apples from our garden." The old woman blinked at her with confused eyes. "Who are you?" "Sarah, tell these people to leave the room." Chloe Higgins turned her cold gaze toward Hazel, her eyes moving down the front of the green dress to the mended sleeves. "Ah, the new companion is still here," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "I am surprised Mr. Miller chose someone who looks so much like a kitchen maid to sit in this beautiful room. One would think Silverwood Crest could afford proper staff." Hazel stood up from her low stool and made a small, correct curtsy. "Mrs. Stone is very tired today, Miss Higgins," she said, keeping her voice perfectly even. "Perhaps it would be best if she takes her rest now." Chloe laughed, a sharp sound that made the old lady flinch in her chair. "Listen to the girl," she said to her sisters. "She has been here for less than 2 weeks, and already she speaks as if she owns the estate. In a dress like that, one should be careful not to mistake oneself for a lady." Hazel did not reply to the insult, choosing instead to lean down and offer her arm to Abigail. "Come, ma'am," she said softly. "Let us take a short walk down the long portrait gallery. The light is very nice there today." The old woman took her arm with trembling fingers, and Hazel guided her slowly toward the side door, completely ignoring the four sisters who stood whispering near the tea table. In the long portrait gallery, the afternoon light came through the high windows in long, cold bars, lighting up the dust motes that danced in the air. Hazel walked slowly beside the old woman, her boots making no sound against the thick wool runner that covered the center of the floor. Abigail seemed to have forgotten the unpleasant scene in the morning room, talking instead about a white pony she had owned when she was a young girl living near the coast. "His name was Snowflake," the old woman murmured, her fingers tightening on Hazel's sleeve. "He would eat sugar right out of my palm." "He sounds like a beautiful pony, ma'am," Hazel said, keeping her eyes on the portraits ahead. As they reached the center of the gallery, she heard a soft step behind them, and turned to see Benedict Stone walking toward them from the shadow of a large archway. He wore no hat, and his white hair seemed to gleam in the dim light of the corridor, his pale face serious and still. "Good morning, Aunt," he said, his voice low and deep like the sound of distant water. Abigail looked up at him, a rare smile touching her old lips. "Benedict, you should see the pony. He is waiting by the stable door." "I will look for him later, Aunt," he replied gently, bending his head to press his forehead against her white hair for a brief second. He straightened up and turned his dark eyes toward Hazel, his gaze steady and intense. "Miss Brooks," he said, using her proper name for the first time. "Mr. Finch informed me that visitors arrived in the morning room a short time ago. I believe they spoke to you in a manner that is not permitted in this house." Hazel looked down at the floorboards between them, her hands folding over her green skirt. "It was nothing of importance, sir. Miss Higgins was merely surprised to find me here." "It is of importance to me," Benedict said, his voice dropping into a colder tone that made the air in the gallery feel like winter. "Silverwood Crest is my home, and anyone who enters through my gates must respect the people who live and work beneath this roof. Miss Higgins and her sisters have been asked to leave the estate immediately, and their carriage will not be admitted to these grounds again." Hazel lifted her eyes to his face, her breath catching slightly at the absolute certainty in his voice. "Sir, you did not need to send them away on my account. I am only your aunt's companion." "You are a member of this household, Miss Brooks," Benedict said, stepping a fraction closer so that she could feel the coldness that seemed to radiate from his clothes. "And I do not allow my guests to insult the people who care for my family. I am sorry that you were treated poorly today." Hazel felt a strange warmth rise in her chest, a feeling she had not known since her father's death. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, making a short curtsy as he turned to walk back toward the north wing. The winter came early to the northern woods, covering the hillsides in deep snow that blocked the valley roads for 3 weeks in November. During these cold days, small changes began to happen in Hazel's small room at the top of the house. One morning, she found a pair of thick leather shoes sitting outside her door, their soles heavy and new, perfectly sized for her feet. There was no note attached to the leather, but when she asked the housekeeper about them, Mrs. Gable only smiled and shook her head. "The master notices when a person walks through the wet snow in thin slippers," the older woman said, as she ironed a pile of linen sheets. "He has an eye for what people need, even if he never says a word about it." A week later, a thick wool coat made of dark gray cloth appeared in the same spot, its lining warm and soft against the winter chill. Hazel wore the coat every afternoon when she took Abigail for her short walks along the enclosed veranda, feeling the heavy fabric protect her from the freezing mountain wind. She knew the gifts came from Benedict, but she did not know how to thank a man who only appeared in the hallways after the sun had gone down behind the pine trees. One evening, while she was taking her supper in the warm kitchen with the other servants, Mr. Finch, the butler, set a small silver tray down on the wooden table. "The master requests your presence in the small library after you have finished your tea, Miss Brooks," the butler announced, his face perfectly serious. Hazel finished her bread quickly, smoothed down the front of her green dress, and walked through the quiet corridors until she reached the library door. She knocked softly, and entered when a low voice called out from within the room. Benedict was sitting in a large leather chair by the fire, a large open book resting on his knees. His white hair looked silver in the firelight, and his pale hands were resting against the dark leather of the armrests. "Come in, Miss Brooks," he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite his own. "My aunt has gone to sleep, and I wish to speak with you about a letter that arrived from the lower valley this afternoon." Hazel sat down, her heart beating a little faster against her ribs as she watched his pale face. "A letter from my aunt, sir?" she asked. "Yes," Benedict said, his dark eyes fixing upon hers. "She writes that a local merchant, a man named Mr. Potts, who owns 3 flour mills in the town, has expressed a desire to take you as his wife. She states that he is a wealthy widower of 55 years, and she intends to come here tomorrow to take you back to the valley." Hazel felt the blood leave her face, her fingers tightening into the fabric of her skirt until the mended lace at her wrists strained against her skin. "I do not wish to marry Mr. Potts, sir," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper that was barely louder than the crackle of the oak logs in the hearth. "I have never met the man, and my aunt only wishes to be rid of any responsibility for my future." Benedict watched her face for several long seconds, his expression completely unreadable as the firelight danced across his marble skin. "You are 23 years old, Miss Brooks, and under the law, your aunt cannot force you to marry against your will if you have a means of supporting yourself," he said quietly. "If you choose to stay here at Silverwood Crest, your position as my aunt's companion remains secure for as long as you wish to hold it. No one will come into this house and take you away if you do not desire to go." Hazel looked into his dark eyes, finding a steady strength there that made the fear leave her chest as quickly as it had arrived. "I want to stay here, sir," she said clearly. "The work is good, and Mrs. Stone has been very kind to me since the day I walked through your gates." "Then it is settled," Benedict said, closing the book on his knees with a firm sound. "I will see your aunt myself when she arrives tomorrow morning, and I will inform her that you have chosen to remain in my employment. You may return to your room now, Miss Brooks." The next morning, Hazel stood near the top of the central staircase and listened to the loud, angry voice of her aunt rising from the entry hall below. Mrs. Weaver was a large woman, dressed in heavy furs, her face red from the cold ride, and her words sharp as she spoke to Mr. Miller. "The girl is my brother's child, and she has no right to turn down a wealthy marriage just to remain a servant in this lonely house," her aunt shouted, shaking her muff at the manager. Benedict stepped out from the library then, his white hair and pale face causing the older woman to stop speaking mid-sentence, as she looked at him with sudden terror. "Mrs. Weaver," Benedict said, his voice low and cold as ice, "your niece is a free woman who has signed a proper employment contract with this estate. She has stated clearly that she does not wish to return with you or marry the merchant you have chosen for her." "But sir," the aunt stammered, her voice losing its anger as she looked into his dark eyes. "Mr. Potts is a respectable man with a large house. Miss Brooks has a house here," Benedict replied, stepping down the first 3 steps of the stairs until he stood between the woman and the staircase. "And I will not allow anyone to trouble her while she is under my protection. Your carriage is waiting at the door, madam. I suggest you return to the valley before the snow grows any deeper." Mrs. Weaver looked at his pale face for one more terrified second before turning on her heel and hurrying out into the cold morning air, leaving the great hall perfectly quiet once more. The weeks of winter moved into December, and the great house settled into a deep, peaceful silence that Hazel grew to love. Every afternoon, Benedict would come down from the north wing to sit with his aunt, choosing a small chair near the fire while Hazel read aloud from old history books or collections of simple poetry. He never spoke much during these hours, but he listened to every word she read, his dark eyes never leaving her face as her voice filled the warm room. Hazel began to notice small things about him that she had not seen before. The gentle way he lifted his old aunt's hands when she complained of the cold, and the quiet respect he showed to the oldest servants in the kitchen. He was not the cruel monster the townspeople whispered about in the valley taverns. He was simply a lonely man who had lived too long in the shadows of his own history. One afternoon, after Abigail had fallen asleep in her high-backed chair, Benedict stood up and looked out at the falling snow. "Miss Brooks," he said softly, turning his face toward her, "will you walk with me in the long gallery for a few minutes? The rooms are very warm today, and the air in the corridor is fresh." Hazel set down her small volume of poems and stood up, following him out into the long hallway where the ancestors watched from their golden frames. They walked in silence until they reached the tall window at the far end of the gallery, where the view showed the white peaks of the mountains rising against a gray winter sky. Benedict stopped and turned to look at her, his white hair catching the pale light from the glass. "When you arrived here in the rain 3 months ago," he said, his voice very quiet and plain, "I had spent 7 years believing that I would always live alone in this valley. I had known many women who came to this house seeking wealth or power, and they all looked the same to me because their hearts were full of calculation." He paused, his dark eyes fixing upon her face with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "But when I came into the drawing room that morning, I saw a girl in a faded green dress who did not care about my title or my appearance. You were counting the panes of glass because your mind was strong and your heart was honest. I have not been able to forget you since that hour." Hazel looked up at him, her hands folding over her gray wool coat as she felt the steady beat of her heart. "Sir," she whispered, "I am only a schoolmaster's daughter with nothing to offer a man of your position." "I do not need money or land, Hazel," he said, using her Christian name for the very first time. "I need an honest person to share this long life with me. I am asking you to marry me and become the mistress of Silverwood Crest, if you think you can find it in your heart to care for a man who belongs to the night." Hazel looked at his pale face and his dark, honest eyes, feeling the last pieces of her lonely past fall away into the quiet air of the gallery. She thought of the new shoes he had left at her door, the warm gray coat that protected her from the wind, and the way he had stood between her and her angry aunt, without a single thought for himself. "Benedict," she said, her voice steady and clear, as she stepped closer to his side. "If I say yes to your offer, it will not be because of this great house or the wealth your family owns in the valley. It will be because you truly saw me when I was nothing more than a stranger, standing in the rain, and because you have shown me more kindness than anyone else in the world. Yes, I will marry you." Benedict did not make a grand speech or move to hold her tightly. He simply reached out with a slow, careful movement and took her small hands in his own pale fingers. His skin was very cold, like the winter air outside the glass, but his touch was incredibly gentle as he turned her palms upward to look at the small marks left by her years of hard work. He bent his head and pressed his forehead against her wrists for 5 long seconds, a gesture of quiet devotion that meant more to her than any words of romantic poetry. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a cold morning in January, inside the small stone chapel that stood at the edge of the estate gardens. There were no wealthy guests from the town, and no grand decorations along the wooden pews. Only Mrs. Stone, who sat in the front row with a small bunch of winter berries in her lap, and the old servants who had cared for the house for decades. Hazel wore a plain dress of dark blue wool that Mrs. Gable had made for her hair pinned up simply without any jewels or lace. When Benedict took her ring finger and slid a simple gold band onto her hand, his white hair caught the pale morning light that filtered through the stained glass window above the altar. He looked at her with a calm smile that showed no fear of the future, and Hazel knew as she looked back at him that she had found the only home she would ever need in this world. They walked out of the small chapel together into the crisp winter air, their boots crunching softly against the fresh snow as they headed back toward the warm lights of Silverwood Crest. A full year passed before the autumn leaves began to turn gold once more along the edges of the northern forest, bringing a soft, warm evening to the small library of the estate. The room smelled of clean birch smoke, hot tea, and the sweet scent of dried lavender that Hazel had placed in the small bowls along the bookshelves. A small wood fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting long, gentle shadows across the heavy rug, where Benedict sat reading a small leather book. Hazel sat in her favorite chair by the tall window, her fingers moving slowly as she mended the sleeve of a tiny white shirt made of soft cotton cloth. The shirt was not for herself or for her husband. It was for the child she carried beneath the folds of her dark blue dress, a child who would be born into the warm rooms of this house before the winter snows returned to the valley. Mrs. Abigail Stone had passed away peacefully in her sleep during the early spring, her last hours spent holding Hazel's hand while Benedict stood quietly at the foot of the bed to say goodbye to the woman who had cared for him when he was young. Hazel set her needle down on the small table beside her cup and looked out at the dark line of the pine trees, watching the last purple light of the sunset disappear behind the mountain peaks. She felt a deep sense of peace fill her mind as she thought about the path that had brought her to this quiet room from the muddy road in the lower valley. The future ahead of them was long and uncertain, filled with the changing seasons and the passing years that would bring new life to the old estate. But she knew they would face whatever came together with the same steady strength they had found in each other. She reached down and set her hand over Benedict's silver hair as he leaned his shoulder against her knee, his dark eyes looking up from the page with an expression of complete contentment. The great house was warm and safe around them, and the long evening went on without any need for either of them to break the beautiful silence with a single word. It is a strange thing to look back on the moments that change a life completely, especially when those moments felt so small and heavy at the time they occurred. When I first walked through the gates of this estate with nothing but a single coin in my pocket and the cold rain soaking through my shoes, I believed that the world had forgotten my name and that my path would always be a lonely one. I had learned to make myself small, to count the panes of glass in strangers' windows, and to hide behind a wall of silence so that the unkind words of wealthy people could not find a way to hurt me. I thought that safety meant being invisible, and that the only peace a person could hope for was the quiet that comes from expecting nothing from the world around them. But true peace is not found in hiding from the world, nor is it found in the fine silk dresses or the loud laughter of people who only look at the surface of things. It is found in the quiet moments, when someone looks past the faded fabric of your life and sees the strength you have kept hidden inside your own heart. Benedict saw me when I was nothing more than a shape standing against a drawing-room wall, and his quiet kindness showed me that a home is not just a collection of stone walls and old portraits, but a place where your soul can finally stop waiting for the storm to end. As I look out at the dark woods tonight and feel the small movement of the child beneath my heart, I know that the winter will always return to these mountains, and the wind will always howl through the tall pines. But the fire in this hearth will not go out, and the hands that held me in the gallery will be there to hold the future we are building together in the quiet spaces of this valley. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.